All right, in this video, we are going to start talking about JavaFX. JavaFX is a collection of classes that allow you to write graphical user interface programs. So, a graphical user interface program is just a user interface that allows the user to interact through graphical icons and visual indicators. And most of the programs that we are used to dealing with, that's how they are. Like JGrasp, right? This is a graphical user interface program. Okay. And so most users, in fact, pretty much every user nowadays, right, kind of expects to interact with computers using some sort of graphical user interface. These programs, the graphical user interface programs, are event driven. What that means is that the user actions, like when a user clicks on a mouse button or presses a key on the keyboard, that's going to generate what's called an event. And then that program is going to respond to that event as they occur. All right. So that's a little bit different than the programs that we've been writing for the most part. All right, so JavaFX, it is a software platform for creating a GUI desktop applications and also internet applications. JavaFX, it was intended to replace some older Java GUI platforms, Swing, and before that there was Auth. And this says we'll be using JavaFX 8, but we'll actually be using 11 in this class. Okay. All right, let's take a look at our first JavaFX example. That's hello world fx.java. All right, and it really does not much at all. So compile it. If it doesn't compile for you, then make sure that you have installed and correctly configured JavaFX as I outlined in the previous video. All right, and then when you run this, you're going to get a little window that pops up, and here's the window. Okay, you can see we can resize the window. It has a title up here, hello world, right? And it has the usual things you can do. You can maximize it, you can minimize it, and finally you can X out of it. All right, so that's what it does. And you can see there's the entire code, so not a lot of code. And what we're going to do is just kind of walk through this line by line in this video. All right, so line 1 is an import statement, and we are importing javafx.application.application. And so the JavaFX programs or classes that we write, they will all be child classes of the application class. And you can see that right in this class header right here, that it extends application, right? So our classes will be child classes of this application class. So we have to import that. Whenever a JavaFX application is launched, then the JavaFX runtime does the following things in this order. So it creates an instance of the specified application class. So it creates an object off of there. It calls the init method. You can use that init method to get things set up before the program runs. So for instance, maybe in some games or some programs, specifically games, right, when you start it up, you'll see like a splash screen, and that screen will come up and just be like a loading screen while the program or game loads. So you can use that to kind of kick things off. We won't be using that much at first. Then the start method is called, and this is basically where we will be doing a lot of our work in this section inside of the start method. All right, and then the application will run. The JavaFX will wait for the application to finish. And then when the application is finished, the user closes out the program, then it will call this stop method, and that stop method will basically do the cleanup. If you have some data that needs to be written to a disk or database or something like that, it might do it in that stage. Okay. So if you look in the application class in JavaFX, then you'll see this start method is abstract, and so therefore when we create applications that are child classes of application, that abstract method has to be overridden. All right, and so for the time being, we'll use this method to do the setup of our application. We will always kind of do that, but for right now, we'll be pretty much working exclusively in the start method. And then as our programs get more complicated and we introduce more items and things that you can work with and make more complicated programs, we will start moving some of that code out of the start method, because otherwise, it would be super complex, and that's just going to make it kind of a mess to maintain if we do that. All right, next up on line 2, we have import javafx.stage.stage. So a stage object represents a window on the computer screen. So when we ran this program, we had that window up here. So you can kind of think of this window as being the stage itself, okay? All right, and so this is the stage. So we are importing all that code so we can use that, and that code probably has, I haven't really looked through there, but you can imagine, right? It has a lot of the code that handles, when you resize this window and when you maximize it and close it out and things like that. Okay. All right, on line 3, we have another import, and that's a scene. And so a scene object is an object that you can fill with those graphical user interface components. And so we'll be putting things like buttons, menus, checkboxes, and a lot more stuff that you can put in there. All right, and then that scene is displayed on the stage. So you can see that's kind of like from the theater, right, where you have a stage, and then when you want to put on a play, it has a scene, right? And then they'll put some things on the scene, right? Some props or whatever it is, the scenery, and then the curtain will open, and then you'll see that scene up on the stage. All right. In our program here, we really have nothing in our scene, just to keep the first one as simple as possible. All right. Next up is on line 4, we have another import. And here we are importing javafx.scene.layout.pane. So pane is an example of what's known as a container. And a container basically contains other GUI components, including other containers. All right, so you put stuff in there. And so what we'll be doing is stuffing those containers with buttons and text fields and checkboxes and the other components that we want to make up our graphical user interface. Okay. The technical definition of a container in JavaFX is any descendant of javafx.scene.parent. There's a lot of them, and we will talk about some of those in the second section. But if you want to know, hey, can I use something as a container? Can it contain other GUI elements? Then you need to look to see if it's a descendant of javafx.scene.parent. If it is, then you can most likely put other GUI components inside of it. Okay. There are some unexpected things, like I think a button is a descendant of this maybe, and so you can actually put things inside buttons as well, if I remember correctly. I don't really do that often, so but I think technically that's the case. All right, in the applications that we're going to build, the scene objects have to have at least one container, and that's the container that contains all of the other components. So everything is inside this container. And that component is called the root component. All right. And there's a lot of containers that you can use as the root component of a scene, and so we're just using pane in this first example. All right, that's it. So don't think, a lot of times you'll see people think, oh, I've got to use pane as the root component every time, and you don't have to do that. In fact, you probably don't want to do that, because there's many other types of panes that are better for various purposes. Okay, so this is just an example. It doesn't have to be pane. Okay. All right, and so Line 7 is our class header, right? Our class's name is Hello World FX, and again, it is extending the application class. So our class Hello World FX is a child class of the application class. Okay. That means, right, we know that the start method is an abstract method in the application class, right? And so our class must provide an implementation if we want it to run. Okay. So here we are in the code, and we can see, right, we are providing an implementation of the start method. All right. All right, and so line 10 is the method header for that start method that we have to provide an implementation of, right? And so we will use the start method, and for us, we are going to initialize our applications. The start method has one parameter, which is the stage object. Okay, and remember, stage represents that window. That stage window, that initial stage window, you do not have to create it, right? JavaFX will create that for us, so we don't have to worry about it. And JavaFX will pass that stage object into this method as a when it calls the method. Okay, so it will come into this parameter here. All right. And so next up, right, we are starting in our to build up our root component. And so the root component, remember, that's the component that contains all of the other GUI elements that make up the graphical user interface. And for us, this is going to be the root component, so that's why I've called it root in my code here. All right, so create a pane object. Again, remember, this can be any other container. This just happens to be in this first example, I'm using pane. Okay. All right, and then next up, I am creating a scene object with root as the root component. So once I create that root component, then I create the scene, right? And so here I'm calling the scene constructor. And the scene constructor, it has 3 arguments, right? It has this container, right? The root component that you created, that needs to go first. And then over here is the width and the height that you want for the scene respectively. And those arguments are optional, but a lot of times I like those because if you're testing over and over again, if you don't have these numbers in here, then you'll have to resize the window. It's pretty small if you don't put these numbers in here. So you can put these numbers in here so that you don't have to constantly keep resizing it when you restart the application. All right, so it's the root component will go in here. Then these two, this is the width and this is the height of your scene when it starts up. Okay. So create the scene object. Then I tell the stage what scene to display, right? So the stage, remember, is the window. So I'm saying, hey, in this window, I want you to display this scene that I just created. Right? So here I create this scene. Here I'm telling the stage, right, to display that scene. All right, next up, I set the title, and that is completely optional. You don't have to do that. But here I did it just so I could put Hello World in there and make this as simple as I could possibly get it. Okay, so you'll see that title is right here. Okay, so that's where it will come up. All right, and then I make the stage visible. So you have to call this stage.show. If you forget this, right, then what will happen is that your stage will be built, your scene will be built, but you won't be able to see anything. So you have to explicitly tell it to show that stage and make that window visible. Okay, so right, what you have to do is inside the start method at the bare minimum, all right, is create a root component, create a scene, tell the stage to display that scene that you just created. Also, you have to tell the scene what the root container is, right? Tell the scene when you create it to use the root container that you created. Then tell the stage to display that scene, right? And again, this is optional. But then the last required thing is make sure that you show the stage.show. Okay, that's it. Down here in the bottom part, I have a main method. This is where we call this static launch method that's in the application class. And so that will launch the application, and it will pass these values, any arguments that you have in here, to the application itself. You actually don't even need that. If I comment that out, in fact, if I comment all of this out in JGrasp, it will still work. Let's kill this one and compile it and run it. So in JGrasp, you don't even need that main method or this application.launchArgs for it to run. But in some other IDEs, it will. The reason why is because JGrasp will look for a method named start, and it will fire that up for you. Whereas some other IDEs will not do that. So in some other IDEs, you definitely need to have this here, but not in JGrasp. Also, even if it was JGrasp, if you wanted to pass in some arguments from the command line when you run it into your GUI component, then you would pass it via this method right here. Okay, but that's not really something that we'll have to do for these first applications that we're looking at. All right, and that is it for this overview of the first Hello World application.